Okay, so I hope you got a good experience out of watching the entire mock test happen live because if you're appearing for the Ielts test, this is exactly what is going to happen to you. But there are certain things that I would like to clarify. I did mention some differences due to infrastructural problems that we face over here and that the examiners will not face because that's in a hotel room, it is in a more professional environment and so forth. So one important thing that I would like to clarify over here is that I'm going to be playing the audio that we just recorded of him speaking, and I'm going to grade that response and point out the things that you should do and things that you should avoid doing. However, in the real test, they will be using an old-fashioned tape recorder. So the one with little cassettes in it, and that tape recorder, I believe, is not very sensitive to the sound, not as sensitive as this phone over here is. So right now I'm able to hear the voice clearly, but if you have not spoken clearly in the actual test, then on the tape recorder they may not be able to clearly hear your voice, and in any chance if you apply for a reassessment or something, it may cause some issues. So it is always a good idea to clear your throat before you start speaking, and to make sure that your tone is consistently maintained and that you are just not mumbling things. Don't try and chew up the words, just speak clearly and make sure that you're perfectly audible to the recorder and to the examiner as well. They're never going to ask you that if you can repeat your answer, because that's not going to happen. So you just have one shot at the test. If you fail it, then you know you have to spend another 13,000 to reappear for the test. Alright, so without any delay, let's play the first snippet over here and see how he answers the first question, and then we'll take a look at the comments. Beginning with the part 1, I'd like to talk about school days. So just tell me something about your secondary school.
Oh, it was an interesting time when I was in secondary school, because I met many friends who are still my real friends. So it is very hard to sustain friendship since so long, and I have been enrolled in so many physical activities, sports, swimming and volleyball. So I am feeling lucky that I have such good friends and such good activities to be with till date.
Alright, so couple of things right off the start. The tense that are being used by the candidate here, they are not quite clear. So when he says that I have been enrolled in many activities such as swimming and so forth, so that kind of indicates that he was enrolled while he was at school, and whether or not if he is still enrolled right now. But then I would also like to note that it may not be such a huge deal. It may not cost you an entire band or something, but if these kind of mistakes continue to happen, then you may start losing points for that. Another thing that I noticed in the beginning of the answer was quite fascinating to hear. He said that it is hard to keep in touch with the friends, and just before saying that he also mentioned that they are still my good friends. So it's kind of self-contradicting your own opinion. So if you missed that part, you can just go back, rewind a few seconds and listen to it, and you'll know what I'm talking about. So let's just proceed with the next. So which subject did you find the most difficult at school?
Oh my God. In my school time, even in the recent time, I am finding difficulties in mathematics. It gives me nightmares literally when it was a time of examinations. Specifically trigonometry, integration, derivation, those kind of stuffs scares me a lot.
Alright, so this answer was very good. It was drafted carefully. It focused on the main part of the question as to which particular subject. So he not only said mathematics, but he also went on and explained in mathematics, especially the trigonometry or geometry part that bothered him the most, which is a good thing to do. However, there were certain singular plural errors in the answer, something related to subject verb agreement as well. So those kind of of errors, the examiners, what they will do is they'll just start taking notes, or they may even take mental notes. But I have noticed when I appeared for the test myself, I have noticed them, they do write things on their notepad or little book that they have. So it could be comments, we are not allowed to see that obviously, but then again it could be a list of mistakes that we are making. I'm not exactly sure. Anyways, let's focus on the next question now. Do you ever need that subject now?
At some point, because nowadays I'm into different field where I do not encounter with mathematics, luckily.
Alright, so he does not need that subject, he only rarely needs it. I believe it was a satisfactory answer, but then again I would still add one more line to it, just give a reason as to describe what is my current role and why I don't need mathematics in that role. So, but it is still an acceptable answer. Now, before we proceed, I just remembered something from the previous question. He started with the phrase, "Oh my God." So it is a very, very good idea to do those kind of things. I mean, but then you have to make sure that you maintain your intonations throughout the thing. So if I say something like, "I was very excited to see my friends," so my face doesn't really say that. My tone doesn't really say that either. You're not, however, getting marks for your face though. Your facial expressions, they don't matter at all, but your tone does. So if you say that I was excited to see my friends, it is fine. But if you want to say I was very excited to see my friends, you have to emphasize the part. I can just say it like, I was very excited to see my friends, and that shows that you are just giving a natural response and it is not rehearsed. So in our case, in our candidate's case, what happened is that he said, "Oh my God, that is a difficult question." So now it kind of sounds as if it is a bit rehearsed. So what I would do is I would just improve my intonations over there a little bit and practice using that phrase on a daily basis as well, so that when the time comes, it just comes out naturally. Anyway, so we'll proceed with the next set of questions. Now let's move on and talk about buildings.
Okay.
Are there any famous buildings in your hometown?
Famous buildings, I would say not, because I live in a small village where we don't have that much well-developed infrastructure, so I can consider as a famous buildings. But yeah, near my surroundings, about 50 kilometers far, there is a statue of Unity, which is very famous spot, tourist spot, and nice infrastructure they have.
Alright, so another acceptable answer. It was a very good answer actually, but just one thing that I would like to point out is the repetition of words. So when the question says, "Are there any famous buildings around your hometown or in your hometown," whichever it is, the key words that I would focus on not repeating are buildings, famous, or hometown, and something like that. So I can just say that where I'm from or where I live right now, it does not have many interesting places to see. However, there is one particular monument which is known as the Statue of Unity, and that would be the end of the answer. You don't really need to elaborate any further than that. So now there are some more questions related to buildings. What I'm going to do is we are going to listen to all those questions and then do a combined analysis before we proceed to part 2. In your opinion, do you believe that buildings should be attractive to look at?
In perspective of economy or tourism, building plays a big role, because lot many Indians where I live, I'm an Indian, and they used to spend their vacations on Europe because they have historical buildings. But yeah, by my point of view, it's not that much important to make a building very interesting. It is just a utility for me.
Okay. What is the most unusual building that you have ever seen?
Oh, last year I went Dubai and I have seen Burj Khalifa, which is tallest building. So it is most unusual for me, and additionally it is made on a man-made island, so it makes it unique.
Alright, so there were two questions over here. The first one dealt with should buildings be attractive to look at, and the second one was the most unusual building that you have ever seen. So with the first question, the attractive one, the answer was quite impressive. He managed to talk about public's opinion as well as his own. He said that in terms of public, they do really need to associate some attractive features to buildings, but in his opinion they don't really need those kind of things. So it is always a good idea to give a variety of arguments to the examiner. Sometimes it gets kind of boring to just listen from one point of view, so a good idea. But one note over here though, I would try to shorten the answer a little bit, since it is just part one. You're supposed to give short and to the point answers, but it is still acceptable. The next one about the most unusual building one, again a very good answer. A few times he did stutter a bit here and there and made some minor grammatical errors, but like we discussed in the previous video, some errors are acceptable as long as they don't cause any miscommunication, or the examiner should not be able to misinterpret your message that you're trying to convey. So yeah, part one was quite good. Again, that's the easiest part, however, so we don't still know, we have to analyze the rest of the parts as well. So for the next part, I'm going to play the audio continuously, and if I were you watching at home, I would just take some notes. I'm giving you an assignment to do over here. What you can do is get your pen and paper out. While listening, try to pick up as many mistakes as you can, and try to note down the points that you think you could have done better in a way, and you can always leave those points in the comment section below, so that I will personally give you some responses on there and see if what changes you made are necessary or if they are not a good idea. Let's make it a bit more interactive. I don't want anyone to go to sleep over here, so I'll just play the recording now. Okay, you may begin.
I would like to tell a story about the Statue of Unity, because I read an article of opening ceremony of this tourist spot. My Prime Minister Narendra Modi has recently inaugurated the biggest tourism hotspot in Gujarat, where I live. So I read a newspaper very frequently, and yesterday it was the biggest article on this particular matter, that Statue of Unity is temporarily closed just because the corona pandemic has been going on nowadays. So every tourism spots are closed by the government, and it is very interesting to read whole article for me, is because I have never visited this facility. I would like to spend my 2-3 days over there with my family, and I was literally planning to visit that facility in this summer vacation, but unfortunately due to this corona lockdown we wouldn't make it, and we wouldn't able to make that possible.
Thank you.
Right.
Alright, so that concludes our part 2. I don't know if you were able to hear the last part very clearly, but then I went ahead and exercised my right to be able to stop the candidate when I want. So in the real test as well, we talked about it in the last video about the criteria that the examiners sometimes they may stop you before the 2 minutes, the specified 2 minutes. So the reason, first of all, why I stopped him is that he managed to cover all the 4 points of the topic that was assigned to him. Now, as you can see on the screen, there are 4 different points. The first one was when you heard and read about the story and what the story was about is the second one. Why the story was in the news was the third one, and explain why you thought the story was interesting. So it is clear from the analysis that point 3 and 4, they require the most amount of speaking, and the reason why I stopped him is because he managed to answer all the 4 points during his speech. And I kind of sensed that he was struggling with generating more content to speak, so I had to stop him when I had everything relevant to the cue card. He could have done it way better, of course. He could have elaborated the story in many different ways, used better vocabulary as well. There were certain words that really pointed out, such as when you say something about tourism and something about traveling or hotspots or something like that. I would really expect to hear some words which are relevant to that field. And then with the coherence part as well, there wasn't much that was lacking, but then the story kind of did lack some sort of cohesive devices. So you could have used linkers over there as well to show some transition from point A to point B. So at one moment when you're talking about the pandemic, I kind of want to see some intonations involved in there so that you can score a little bit more extra marks. And then you transit your story from there to why the story was in the news and connect those two things. So if I were the candidate, what I would do is I would just make a single sentence response, and I would just describe everything in short first. And then I would focus on point number 3 and point number 4. Those are the 2 points that require the most amount of speaking. Regardless of your topic, it is always going to be the same scenario. So while speaking about the 3rd and the 4th point, I would connect those things. So as you can see on the screen again, I would just quickly focus on that. The 3rd point says why the story was in the news, and the 4th point asks why you thought it was interesting. So if I'm giving a reason why the story was in the news, I can use the same reason to give why the story was interesting to me. So if I say that it was in the news because it was quite a shock to the viewers, because a lot of people were planning to spend their summer vacation at that hotspot, and owing to the pandemic it has now been closed, and which is why it is interesting for me, because I am one of those people who was planning to go there for a trip myself, and I was also surprised to see that that one chance I had, I don't have it anymore. So now I have managed to connect point number 3 and 4 together so that I can grab some extra points for my coherence in the story. So anyways, the whole response was acceptable. I did, however, have to end it before the time was up, but then as an examiner, I believe that I received enough of the language from him to judge his marks. So moving to the part 3, which like I said in the previous video, is the most difficult part. Alright, so that concludes our part 2. Now I would like to follow up with some questions regarding the same topic, which is our part 3, that is discussion. So when do people like to read the newspaper?
Most of us like to read newspaper in their free time, in the morning while having tea, like I do, I believe.
Why is that?
Just because it gives a fresh start of the day, where you can aware of what is going around with you, and it's a good start with the information and some fun part in the newspaper, so you can be relaxed or you can be tense. It's up to people.
Okay, so the first question over here was, when do people like to read the newspaper? Now, before we proceed, in the exam, the examiner is never going to ask you why when he first asks the question. So when I say that when do people like to read the newspaper, why or why not, I'm not going to say the last part. It is assumed by the candidate that they have to come up with a reason why people read the newspaper in the morning. You can also say that people don't read newspapers at all. I've never seen a person read a newspaper these days. They just open their phones and they take a quick look at the highlights, and sometimes they may watch a YouTube video or something to get their news. So you can formulate your answers either way, but it is still the same thing. So moving on to the next question, how important do you think it is for people to have a choice of newspaper?
It's very important in my point of view, because nowadays journalism are going in a wrong direction, at some point. So people has to choose wisely, because the information we are getting, it depends how we react in future. So it is very important that you should rely on authentic newspaper.
So this answer, I don't believe it was acceptable at all. The first point being, he did not actually answer the question. The question, I think he had some difficulty understanding, and I would like to see how you feel about this question. If you have understood it, then let me know in the comment section below. I'm not going to disclose the entire meaning of it, but I would like to point out certain mistakes that he made, which was related to vocabulary as well. Vocabulary, by vocabulary I mean the repetition of words from the question itself. So newspaper, choice, and so on and so forth. Important, another keyword which I believe you should not have repeated in this answer. Another thing is there were a few mistakes related to subject and verb agreement. So when your subject is first person or second person or third person, there are certain set verbs that you're supposed to use to make sure your tenses are accurate. It does not create miscommunication, but then it is counted as a mistake and you do lose certain points with it. We will discuss more about it when we talk about some grammatical lessons in our future videos, and we'll also see how you reduce the how you lose the marks when we take a look at the band descriptors in detail in the upcoming videos. So let's proceed with the next question. So what does a good newspaper contain?
Good newspaper contain a variety of news, authentic news, and life-changing articles. So any author or journalist can address a whole nation or whole group of community, and the way we can improve our society. So it is very important for me.
Okay. All right. So this answer right here was acceptable to a certain extent. However, it could have been developed a lot more. We could have listed some examples as well. We could have talked about some current situations as well. Current situation, for example, we all know that as soon as we open the newspaper these days, all we look at is bad news. So if I were the candidate, what I would have done is I would have focused on certain current issues, and I would have further elaborated on those issues. So that way, not only I am showing my capability to discuss something at length, but this is a bit more academic setting, the part 3 of the speaking test. So it is always a good idea to form some logical arguments to back up your opinions. So let's move on to the next set of questions. We'll hear all the 3 questions together, and then we'll discuss how the responses were. Let's move on and talk about the future of newspapers. Why do you think some people choose to read the news on the internet instead of the newspapers?
As we have seen that nowadays people are switching towards online platform, and the one more point is to save paper. One should read newspaper online if it's possible. But again, in my country, majority people don't have access of internet or any gadgets so they can access online newspaper. So they will still gonna continue with the old style, and it is not going to change in next 20 years, I guess, in my point of view.
So is there any difference between internet news and the news you find in a newspaper?
Of course there is, because online news comes with digital prints, I mean graphic, a more better graphic than the paper one. So that's the only difference I can say. Or yeah, that's it, because all the content will be the same, just a platform would be the different.
Will internet news ever replace newspapers?
I would say no, because it is not going to happen where people wipe off the old newspaper habit, because it is been like 100 or more years practice. So it is almost impossible to wipe off old newspaper and switching on to online.
Thank you. That would be the end of our test. All right, so as you heard, there were three questions. You would have been able to read those questions on the slides over there as well. Let's start with the first answer that he gave. I really liked the point where he brought up the reason of saving paper, and that's why I think it would be better if we encourage people to read news online. So that is a good example of logical reasoning, which is something you have to do in the part 3 especially of the speaking test, because part 3 is usually the questions on unfamiliar topics, and it is a discussion. You're supposed to give well thought out linked example laden ideas to the examiner, so that it is better in a way for them to understand. You have to discuss the topic at length. So one key thing that I would like to note over here is that the grammatical accuracy is not exactly up to the mark. He did mention one tense that he said in the sentence that they were still going to. So they were still going to is fine, but then in the terms of the sentence that he actually used, you can always rewind back and listen to the first answer that he gave, and you will know exactly what sentence I'm talking about. So those are the kind of things that stand out, and that's something that the examiners will quickly catch, and you may lose points for that. In the second one and the third one, the discussion was quite brief. I would still encourage the candidates to give a little bit longer response, a well thought out response. So for example, in the second question here, it said, how is internet news different from the news you read in the newspaper? So this is a very good question where you have a lot of opportunities to include an example. So you can talk about advertisements as well, that while you're reading something online, you always have an option to block those advertisements. And that's why I personally believe reading news online is quite convenient. You don't really have to carry a huge paper with you and fold it and put it somewhere. You don't really have to worry about the weather, that the paper might get wet. You can just put your phone in your pocket and be on your way. So those are the kind of little things you can think about and include in your response. And like we discussed in the previous video, that with speaking, it is okay to give personal examples. So you can start by talking about yourself and then move towards a more general opinion. So that's something that I would do. I would first talk about my opinion and then focus on the general opinion. So in this particular case, I can just talk about the whole ad thing that I mentioned, and then move on to why there are still some people who cling to the old, the paper-based newspapers. So it maybe just gives them a particular feel to be able to hold that paper in the hand and read it. So those are the kind of things you can include in that. In the last one, will internet news ever replace newspapers? So again, it is basically a yes or no question. You just start by saying yes or no, and if you think that it would replace it just to a certain extent, then you can go with that as well. Over here again, I would still stick to the same response but in a different words. So I can just say that some people might still prefer old newspapers, given the reasons that they like to be able to hold them and whatnot, and some may not be well equipped with technology, or they are not very comfortable using technology, so they may still prefer paper-based newspapers, whereas the others, they are already moving on, and I believe in the future they will continue to move on as well. So yeah, that was the end of the discussion on how this candidate's speech was. So judging by the performance over here, I am going to analyze, I have already analyzed the mistakes that he made, the good parts of the speech and everything. So before we discuss band descriptors, it won't make any sense for me to give you an exact score of how much bands I would give this candidate, but I would still give him a 6 band score, overall 6 for the entire speaking test. And remember this part, because when we discuss the band descriptors for speaking, we will come back to this and discuss why I'm giving 6 bands to this candidate. So the band descriptors are basically a public version of the marking criteria in detailed explanation. I will be sure to leave a link in the description so that you guys can download it from the internet. They are free, they are available for public use, and they should give you an idea as to what kind of things are required to improve your score. However, it is likely that you may not understand the entire part, so we will create a special video for those kind of things and discuss them in detail just to clear your doubts. So anyways, that would be the end of our special session today. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to mention it in the comments, like it, share it with your friends, share it with other candidates appearing for the IELTS test. Maybe it is helpful for them, maybe not, we never know. But we will continue to keep trying our best to give you the best content and in the most accurate and convenient way. So again, thank you for watching. Please like, share and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already done so. And don't miss out on the previous videos of writing and speaking. And we'll catch you in the next video. Thank you.